Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Millen, and today we'll be talking about data-driven present levels and goals, collecting data and ensuring IEP compliance. And this is just part one of a two-part series. So on September 13th, I'm really excited that we'll have a live 2-hour session. So as a follow-up to this webinar that's recorded, there'll be a live opportunity for us to engage online and practice writing goals together and discuss a little bit more. So I'm really excited for part two of this workshop as well. So I hope you can take from this first part of the two-part series, and then if you think of any questions at all or anything that you want to work on, bring that to the second part of this series. So I look forward to seeing many of you then. So the beginning code for this webinar is data. And again, I'm Caitlin Millen, and I have worked in a variety of settings in deaf education and special education over the past 18 years, using all different communication modes, so including American Sign Language, listening and spoken language. I've also worked in mainstream settings as an itinerant teacher and a classroom teacher. And I started summer camps for children who are deaf or hard of hearing in Colorado and Massachusetts. I completed my PhD at the University of Northern Colorado, focused on students who are deaf or hard of hearing and self-determination. So we actually have another webinar from before on the self-determined learning model of instruction that you might have seen previously. And I also recently directed statewide services for students who are deaf or hard of hearing ages 3 to 22 in Maine. And now I'm working as an IEP consultant. So I'm working with all different teachers, schools, and districts, supporting them with writing data-driven compliant IEPs and also providing workshops. And there's a link to my website here, along with a QR code that will bring you there as well, in case you have any questions or if you want to share with your school about that opportunity. Okay, so for today, we are going to be talking about first, data-driven present levels aligned with goals, baseline to progress monitoring. So we're going to start with an IEP goal formula. You've probably heard of SMART goals before, but we'll dig into those a little bit more and give specific examples that are relevant to deaf education. Everyone always asks, how do you measure self-advocacy? So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk a little bit about objectives, and then I'll show you how to write a present level that's aligned with that goal. So a data-driven goal aligned with the present level. We always think about the present levels first, but because we're going to follow this formula, I'll introduce that formula first. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And as we'll also talk about data collection planning. So we'll look at skills that are a little bit more challenging to measure, as well as how you can reduce the data collection burden. So, I have been in the trenches. I know what it's like to have so much on your plate as a teacher. And so we'll talk about how can you reduce some of that burden on you to collect data, but at the same time meet those needs. And then we'll also do a sort of a check for understanding at the end. There'll be a little multiple choice series of questions. And just a quick follow-up to this agenda. I just want to mention on September 13th, we are going to talk about, as I mentioned, more of like a workshop format where we're going to practice some of the data-driven present level and goal writing, but we'll also talk about IEP compliance on that during that September 13th workshop. So I actually have a really awesome IEP compliance checklist. So that's something that you all will get as part of that September 13th workshop, and we'll go through on how to use that. So it includes a checklist of all of the most common reasons IEPs are often out of compliance, and how you can use that checklist to make sure your IEPs are legally compliant. So as that's a really common issue, that IEPs might be out of compliant without you even realizing it. So we'll talk more about that in the second workshop. Okay, so the objectives between today's workshop and that second workshop that I talked about include being able to state at least 2 examples of how to measure baseline skills and collect data to monitor progress toward IEP goals, writing data-driven present levels align with SMART goals, and being able to state at least 2 common IEP compliance issues and how to ensure you're writing compliant IEPs. So again, that compliance piece is going to be, we'll talk more about that in part 2. Okay, so quick review. What is a SMART goal? Most of you probably learned about SMART goals in your teacher preparation program, but we're going to do a real quick review of it because we'll dig into this a bit more. So as you know, specific. So when we think specific, we want somebody else to be able to replicate that. So for example, rather than saying with support, John will, ... you could say using a graphic organizer, John will, ... So anyone else could read that goal and know exactly what you mean. So if that student requires support to work on that goal, then you're naming exactly what type of support, not just saying with support, because someone else reading that goal might not know what that means. Okay, measurable. So we'll discuss this a little bit more, but basically you need to be able to show us the data. Attainable, so appropriate for 1 year of growth, and breaking into objectives if appropriate. So we'll talk a little bit more about objectives. And relevant, so based on the evaluation data at the top of the IEP. So in order for it to be included in the IEP, it must be educationally impacting the student to be part of the IEP. So for example, you could have a student could have some needs, like for example, maybe they have anxiety, but it doesn't impact them educationally. It could impact them educationally, but if it doesn't, then it should not be part of the IEP. So it needs to be a need that's identified that impacts the student educationally in the classroom, at school. And that is determined by those evaluations in that evaluation section at the top of the IEP. So you're starting out with, what is that student's present level? What do the evaluations show? And what is relevant? What are the needs that are being shown based on that data? Time bound. So I always include by a particular date. So I name the specific date. So that way it's really clear, this is the date when this goal ends. Usually it's the due date of the next IEP. However, if there is a plan for the IEP team to reconvene sooner, then you could put that earlier date. Also, if you break your goal down into objectives, it could have different dates for different parts for those different objectives. So maybe the first objective is in the fall, the second objective is in the winter at the end of that term, third objective is in the spring. So just some examples there. Okay, this is actually a handout that is going to be available to you all through Google Drive. So you should have access to a Google Drive folder as part of participating in this workshop. And I'll actually give you a quick tour of that Google Drive folder in a little bit, so that you can see all of the resources that are in there. But this is one of the resources. It's just a quick handout. And, again, you might feel really comfortable with writing SMART goals, or you might have learned about this before, but this is just a quick handout that you can use as a reference when you're writing goals to make sure you're hitting all of those areas of the SMART goal. So it includes the time frame, support, setting, skills, accuracy level, and assessment. So now I'll show you an example of what that looks like. So in this example, there is a data-driven goal talking about ASL use and spoken language in the classroom. So here you have your date at the beginning. You have the supports also at the beginning, giving pictorial supports. You also have the setting there in the self-contained classroom. You have the particular skill. So that's the use of ASL and spoken language to advocate for the use of the bathroom when needed. And then with no more than one reminder. So that's, again, at more specific support level in 4 out of 5 trials as measured by a daily data tracking spreadsheet. So that's how you're measuring it. So going back, we have time frame, supports, setting, skill, accuracy level, and then the assessment, which is the data tracking spreadsheet in this case. Okay, so is this a data-driven goal? Take a moment to read this goal and think, is this a data-driven goal? So just take a moment right now, pause the video if you need to, and think to yourself if this is a data-driven goal or not. Okay, so I want to know what you all think. We can talk about it a little bit more at the live in-person workshop, but basically this is not a data-driven goal. And the reason is because of the end of the goal where it says teacher observation. Do not use teacher observation as a measure. It's subjective. So that means, it can be influenced by opinion. So if you are using your own observation as a measure of a skill, that means it can be influenced by maybe how you're feeling that day. Maybe you're not feeling so good and you rate the student lower, or maybe the student is misbehaving, but it's actually their skills are still strong, but that behavior of the student might influence how you're observing the student or collecting that data. So that's why we should not use teacher observation. And the other thing is self-advocacy is a skill that can be measured and specific. So we're actually going to discuss a bit more about self-advocacy assessments and alternatives to teacher observation. So what you can write instead of that. So here are some self-advocacy assessments that you all now have access to through Google Drive. So included in that Google Drive folder that I mentioned that you'll have access to is this whole set of various self-advocacy assessments. These are just ones that I've found, but if you know of any others that I didn't include, I'd love to hear about it, or maybe there's a newer version of one of these. If that happens, just let me know. My contact information is going to be at the end here. So I'd love to hear about it, but here's a list of all these great options of ways that you can measure self-advocacy skills specifically so that you don't have to write teacher observation. Okay, so let's take a look at that same goal that we were looking at with teacher observation. How could we rewrite this goal so that it is data-driven? Okay, so here is one example. Oh, and I forgot to mention that with the previous version of this goal, it just says self-advocacy skills, but that is a wide umbrella of skills. There are so many different types of self-advocacy skills, so you can get much more specific with this goal by naming the exact self-advocacy skill. And you can get ideas for that from some of these assessments. So This is an example of a new goal that you can take a moment to read, and it's using the I Can self-advocacy skills checklist. So that's, again, included in your Google Drive folder. But if you name a particular assessment that isn't widely known to all teachers, then what you can do is attach it to the IEP, or if you use your own teacher-made rubric, you can attach it to the end of the IEP. So that's why I said see attached. And then accommodations and consumer awareness self-advocacy skills are, that's a set of skills on that particular checklist. And there are 10 skills on there. So it's based on that. So that's just one example of how you can rewrite a goal and turn it into a SMART goal using one of those self-advocacy assessments. And I'm going to share my screen a moment so that I can show you this particular checklist. So just a moment while I switch screens. Hang on. All right. So I am going to pull up this spreadsheet and reshare my screen. Here we go. All right. So you should have access, you should be able to see this I Can self-advocacy checklist. And if you scroll down at the bottom, this last section that says, that's orange, it says accommodations and consumer awareness. And if you count the number of skills, excluding that bottom section where it says post high school, just high school and above, there are 10 skills altogether. So if you are using that section as a measure, then it should be out of 10. If you use the entire checklist, you can count out how many skills there are on the entire checklist, but that would probably be less specific. So I would recommend honing in on one particular area so you can get more specific. So for example, this top section, count how many checklists, how many skills there are, and then your measure would be out of that many skills. All right, so I'm going to go back to the presentation just a moment. Okay. All right, so that was the one that we just took a look at using the I Can self-advocacy skills checklist. Okay. All right, so I have an activity for you all. So I'd encourage you to pause the video after I'm done explaining and try this out yourself. There's a QR code with a link to a particular assessment. So it's one of the assessments for self-advocacy that's included in your Google Drive folder. Specifically, it's the informal inventory of independence and self-advocacy skills for deaf and hard of hearing students. So you can use that QR code to access the link to it, or you can navigate through the Google Drive folder either way, and pull up that assessment. And then what I'd like you all to do is to try rewriting that same goal using this informal inventory assessment instead. So you have an example of how to write it with the I Can self-advocacy skills checklist. If you wanted to use this informal inventory, how would you rewrite this goal? So pause the video for a couple minutes and take a couple minutes to try rewriting this goal yourself. And then if you have any questions about this, please bring those questions to our part 2 workshop we can talk a little bit more about it. But I'd love for you to give this a try right now. Okay. So here are some examples of how to use that particular assessment and rewriting that goal using that assessment. So this would be an example of if this student's baseline is 2 to 3 for each skill. Using then our goal is for him to go up to 4 or 5. And we can take a look at that assessment a little bit later if we have time, as we're taking a tour of our Google Drive folder. But there's one example of how to write that into a SMART goal using that specific assessment. And here is one other example. So if his baseline is an overall average of 3, what you might write. Okay. And there are a lot of different ways that you can write it. So this example is saying that he's scoring an average of 4 in self-advocacy skills area measured by the formal inventory. And this one says 4 to 5. So these are just 2 different examples of how that could be written. Okay, here's one here, and then now we have a couple examples using figurative language and context clues. So here's one other example of a SMART goal. So just take a moment to read that. And one other example, you can take a moment to read that as well. All right, present level. So I mentioned that we always want to start with the present levels before we write goals. So I know this is a little bit flipped because we started talking about the goals, but I just wanted to show you that formula as a way you can format it. So that will give you your formula for your present level as well. A lot of times I see folks writing that a student their present level is fairly vague. So they might say something like he is doing well in this area. And so here's that SMART goal example that we took from before. And rather than just saying that he has some self-advocacy skills, we want to get just as specific and data-driven with our present level. And we can do that by basically copying that SMART goal, using it in the present level, and just changing it essentially to present tense and what their current data point is. So for example, presently giving fading teacher prompting, Jose is able to demonstrate 2 out of 10. So you're right now, that's his level. So you are doing you're using that assessment to measure his baseline. And then later on, you're going to use that same assessment to measure his progress and hopefully determine when he meets his goal. So that if you follow that same formula for the present level as you did for the SMART goal, that will give you a strong data-driven present level that is well aligned with the goal. You can use a different assessment for the present level. It is okay as long as it's a data-driven present level. However, if you use the same assessment rather than a different one, then folks can more easily see the growth. So for example, if one assessment shows out of a total of 20, and then your goal is out of 5 or 10, a different measure, and it's a totally different assessment, then it's kind of hard to compare apples and oranges. Versus in this example, we have the exact same checklist being used in the present level and the goal. And if you're starting out the school year and you have new students and you need to write goals immediately, this is an area where you can collect data pretty quickly to write that present level. So you shouldn't be, just making up or putting something vague just because you get a new student and you need to write an IEP quickly. Just do the best you can to collect that baseline data so that you really have that strong goal and present level based on their current needs. And also, this is actually the most common reason IEPs are out of compliance, because the present levels don't include data. So it is a legal issue as well. So to provide further motivation. And then I also want to mention that the goal shouldn't always be 80% or 4 out of 5 trials. I almost always see that, or very frequently see that, but it shouldn't just be a given that that's the percentage. It should be based on the student's baseline and what you think is a reasonable amount of growth over a whole year. Okay, so here's a chance for you to practice writing the present level. So you can take one of your present levels, or one of your SMART goals, or one of the other ones in this presentation, and write what the student can do. So I often see present levels that say something like the student is struggling with reading, or they have challenges with this particular area. Even though that might be the case, that they have challenges in an area, your present level should focus on what they presently can do. So presently, they can do this with this amount of support, with teacher prompting and a graphic organizer, or whatever that level of support is. And maybe the goal is to do it without support, or maybe presently they can do it in 0 out of 10 trials. That might be the case, but regardless, you want to write it in that form rather than in a deficit-based form. And then you also want to use the same language as the goal, as I mentioned, changing the date to presently or currently, and changing it to present tense, and then the data to reflect that student's present level. Okay, so here is one example of how to do that. Another example, so just take a moment to read that. Okay, objectives. When should we include them? So basically, you need to understand the requirements of your school or district. This is different across the country. I know we're all part of a particular state here, so we want to think about what the needs are in your school or district. And sometimes it's required, sometimes it's not. So you just want to understand first what the requirements are, and then also if it is left up to you whether or not you need to include objectives. A great time to break down objectives is when you have a goal that has multiple components, or maybe a particular timeline. So a really nice way to use objectives is to break it down by term or semester. So say you have 4 terms over the year, you could have objectives that match the dates for when your progress reports are due for each of those terms. So that way you're outlining, okay, I'm hoping, our hope is for the student to be to meet this objective the first term, and this objective the second term. It doesn't mean you must, it just means that's your goal, and that's what you'll be working towards. And then you can report in your progress report whether or not that student met that objective yet. All right, so data collection. I love this topic. So we are going to dig into how to measure qualitative growth in academic subjects. So this is often a question that I get. So how can you measure those skills that are really kind of tricky to measure? How can you do that? So we'll give some examples here. So for example, this is a 7th grade expository writing rubric. I just Google rubrics for a particular skill. So for example, 8th grade persuasive writing rubric. And then you can either use something that you find, or you can adapt it to your own needs based on the particular students you're working with. But this is just one that I Googled and found, but you could also create your own if you want. And so for example, if you take a writing sample from a 7th grade student you're working with, and they score a 3 in organization, a 4 in development of ideas, a 2 in use of language and conventions, their score based on this rubric, 3 + 4 + 2 is a 9, so 9 out of 12 based on, and you would say based on a teacher-made grade 7 expository writing rubric, see attached. So if you do use your own rubric, you need to attach it to the end of the IEP so that it's clear how that skill is being measured. And so that would be the present level, 9 out of 12 based on this particular rubric. And then maybe your goal is for them to get a 12 out of 12 or 11 out of 12, depending on their current skills. So you always want to think, if this student moves to another state tomorrow, will the team in that state be able to follow the IEP? So you want it super clear. You know, there might be an assessment that everybody at your school knows about, and it seems obvious, but sometimes students move unexpectedly, and sometimes there isn't time for a transition meeting where you can pass off information, and that new school district might just get the IEP and that's it. So you want it to be so clear that anybody in the country could pick up that IEP and know exactly what you're talking about. Okay, reducing the data collection burden. Okay, so we'll talk about how you can reduce some of that burden on yourself. I know it's a lot of work to collect data, but it is so critical. And in our September 13th session, we will talk a little bit more about why it's so critical. And we'll talk about some recent court cases, actually. But the bottom line is that you need to do it. It's not optional. In order to be legally compliant, you must collect the data. So if you can find all those teacher tricks that folks find when they're teaching to make it a little bit easier on yourself, awesome. So a couple of examples are collecting data during your session or class. So rather than doing an activity with a student and then later on processing all that information and maybe scoring something and then writing something up, that's really time consuming, and that is going to take a lot of your time in the afternoon or the evening or maybe even the weekend when it's important to have time for self-care. So think about how can you do it during the session with the students. So maybe you have a little checklist that's subtle that you're using while you're meeting with the student. And it could be in a notebook, an iPad, it depends on the student. So some students are going to be really distracted by an iPad and you wouldn't want to bring an iPad out at all. But other students, that might be no problem to use an iPad if you were checking off something on an iPad. So, pen and paper, however you do it, as long as you're finding some way to collect data. And you could also use student work. So say they're working on a worksheet or some other activity, you can use their student work as your data collection as well. So here is just an example of how you could collect data during a session. So sometimes I see folks write a lot of information when they're collecting data, like they write long descriptions of the activity they're doing, maybe the materials they use. And really for data collection, you don't need to do all of that. You just need the specific data of correct versus incorrect, how many trials, maybe the specific words. So think about what is the minimal information I need here to be able to document for this goal. You don't need to write lengthy explanations about the activities unless you want it kind of for your own reference for the future, but that's not what the data collection is about. It's about getting those percentages, the trials, so that you can see that growth over time. So during the session, you could, we'll show all different ways that you can collect this, but you could use a check or an X for correct or incorrect. So in here I have V's, that's really a check for correct, and X's for incorrect. So for example, in this top session here, I have 6 checks and 3 X's. So 6 out of 9 correct, which equals 67%. And then this particular goal was about prepositions. And I wrote down which prepositions the student responded to correctly, which ones are incorrect. So then we know for the next session, okay, next time we want to work on those particular prepositions. And then ASL word imitation, that's another example. We have 4 out of 7 correct for that first trial, and then we have 4 out of 8 correct, so we had a couple of opportunities there, and then so we have all different goals on here, and then at the very bottom, that last row where it says B, E, C, C, B, E, you could come up with your own codes. So it could be whatever makes sense to you that you're going to be able to then take that data and report on. I'm going to just make sure I'm sharing the screen correctly. Hang on just a moment. All right. Okay. Sorry, just wanted to double check that. Okay, so for example, if you are looking at ASL word imitation, you could say, you could use B for babble, E for emerging, C for correct, and just write letters to notate. You could use symbols. And so for this example, 2 were correct, 2 were emerging, and 2 were babbling. So think about the ways that you can write down notation. Also, you might have a student who might see the checks and X's and be really distracted by that. So you could use other codes, whatever you think is going to work for you that's not going to detract from the session. You calculate that percentage correct for each session. And then right, and then you could have the detailed notes about the activities somewhere else if you want, but again, that's not required. Okay, I would like to show you the resource folder from Google Drive. So just a moment while I pull that up. Okay, and then I'm going to share my screen. Hang on. All right. So this is the Google Drive folder that was should have been shared with you all. And if you do not have access to it, make sure you request access so that you can access all these handouts. So in here, we're just going to do a quick tour of the folder. In here, you have that SMART IEP goal formula that we talked about at the beginning. There's also an accessible version. So if there's someone who needs just the text version in large print, there is that version as well. There's also a handout of the PowerPoint from today. And then there are 2 folders here. One is that folder of self-advocacy assessments. Those are the ones that we talked about. And let's see, so we have the informal inventory that we talked about earlier. And then there's the I CAN self-advocacy checklist. So those are a couple of examples. And then we have the data collection resources folder. So this has all kinds of different ways that you can collect data, because there's not as one particular way you must do it. You should find what's going to work for you and the students you're working with. So for example, this first one here is a student data spreadsheet, and it's coming up in Google Sheets. So I just want to show you this. It has dates on here that are a little bit older, but what you can do is make a copy of this. So if you go to file and then make a copy, then you can make a copy for yourself and edit this form. So there are different tabs at the bottom: student 1, student 2, student 3, 4, 5, and then we have the goals at the top here. And then there's also a drop down menu of options for types of responses for that particular goal. So this is something you could edit. You could create your own in Google spreadsheets, but this is just one example of what you could use to collect data with your particular students. Okay, we'll go back to this example. So this is in Google Docs, and this is for one particular student on one page. So it has the goals at the top, the hours that I'm meeting with her, dates, and then it's has success, continue with, and then notes to continue next time. And this is a great place to document if maybe a student was absent, and you can document other things that might have come up. So that's another example here. And then let's see, we have the one that we went over in the presentation where it has check marks to percentages. Then we have this one. Let's see. So this is another template. This is just a blank one, just in a different format. And then we have a Google form. So some folks create a Google form for every, a Google form that you can fill out for every session. So there's just one form, and then every time you meet with that student, you're completing these responses. So for example, 2 out of 5, 3 out of 5, and you can go through and kind of mark it off and then hit submit. And what it does is it will collect, Google Forms will collect all of that data for you, and then you can go to responses and see where there's this little green box on the right side that says link to sheets. So you can actually get that Google form to then download as a spreadsheet. So it will take all of your data that you've entered for each session and put it into one spreadsheet, which is really beautiful. We want to make it work smarter, not harder. Okay. And then here's another example of a form with different checks, check plus, etc. And these are just assessments that you can use to collect data during those sessions. Here's another example. Let's see. Oh, this is an example that has a particular objective. So we have the goal at the top, and then this is reporting on different objectives as part of that goal. So you might, for example, you might work on just objective 1 for a few weeks, and then eventually you move to working on objective 2. And maybe your data collection looks a little bit different based on objective 2. But again, you're putting down the percentages each time and how many correct, so that you can then show the student was at 2 out of 10 at the beginning of the semester, and then they actually got to the point of mastering this skill, and then we moved on to objective 2. So those are just some examples of how you could do that. Or that might be a really great debriefing tool with the student. You see, like, okay, the scores dipped down this week, what was going on this week, maybe they didn't feel good. That can be working on self-awareness with the student. Okay, so that is your Google Drive folder. I'm going to go ahead and navigate back to the PowerPoint. So just a moment. Here we go. All right, we're rolling now. Okay, so to wrap up today, I have some multiple choice questions for you to consider. So again, pause the video if you need to. Take a moment to really think for yourself. I really encourage you to, really think for yourself and not just watch. See if you can answer some of these questions. And then if you have questions, bring them on September 13th. So here's the first question for you all. What is one assessment that can be used to measure self-advocacy skills and to monitor progress? So again, pause the video if you need to, think about what your response is, and I'll discuss the answer in just a moment. Okay, the answer to this question is F. So it's basically B and C. So going back to those choices, you see B and C, the I CAN self-advocacy checklist we talked about. We also talked about C, the informal inventory. The self-determination inventory is a measure, it's an awesome measure of self-determination that we talked about in a previous self-determination workshop. And self-determination is a broader set of skills that include self-advocacy. But if you really want to measure self-advocacy, you need a more specific assessment for that. The Empower Me is actually just something I made up. It's not real. So that is how we got to that particular answer. Okay, next question. What is one way to collect data on a skill that may be a little bit more challenging to measure, such as descriptive writing, that will provide you with data for measuring progress toward an IEP goal? So again, pause your video if you need to, take a moment to read the options and write down what you think your response would be. Okay, ready? The answer is A, using a descriptive writing rubric. So that's just one example. So going back to these options here, using a descriptive writing rubric, particularly one with really clear benchmarks and scoring. So for example, in the example that we looked at with writing, paragraph structure, for example, 4 points. If the paragraph includes a topic sentence, 3 to 4 supporting sentences, and a concluding sentence. So it's super clear how that student can get 4 points there. And then as far as B, the general ed teacher, although consulting the general ed teacher or observing the student during class may provide some useful information, it's really insufficient data collection for reporting on progress toward an IEP goal. Again, it's subjective, up to opinions, but it could be really useful information. So I'm not saying don't do it, just saying that that's not how you would collect data for that IEP goal. And also, if you review a writing sample and you provide a simple letter grade like A, B, C, D, F, that also doesn't really provide enough information to measure progress toward an IEP goal. So again, A was the answer here. Okay, next question. This is actually the last one. When collecting data during sessions, a teacher estimates how often a student is correctly demonstrating a skill during each session. She records the percentage for each session when they work on that skill and keeps track of it in a spreadsheet. Is that sufficient data collection? So again, pause your video if you need to, take a moment to respond to this question, and then we'll talk about the answer in just a moment. Okay, the answer is B. So no, it is not sufficient, basically. Estimations, as we talked about, are subjective. It's can be influenced by opinions or feelings. But if you use checklists, rubrics, student worksheets, or other data to measure a student's progress, those are objective and based on fact. So although you might want to keep track of activities for your own reference, it's not necessary for data collection to report on progress toward an IEP goal. So that's that C answer. You really only need to collect data regarding the progress towards the skills targeted in the IEP goal. So again, the answer is B. Okay. That wraps up our session for today. So if you have questions that are really burning, you can feel free to send me a message, send me an email. I'm going to have my contact information at the end here. But otherwise, if it's something that you either can wait or you want to discuss, please bring your questions to our session on September 13th. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really am looking forward to seeing you all then and having some rich discussion. The N code is driven. Again, just wanted to mention the primary reason IEPs are often out of compliance is because the present levels are not data driven. We'll talk more about IEP compliance at that next workshop. So the N code is driven, and here is my contact information. So it has my email address, website, QR code. If you have any questions that come up, let me know. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you so much for joining us today.